Let me tell you something I've never told anyone properly, not the way it really happened. I'm an old woman now. My hands shake when I pour the tea. But there was a time when these same hands scrubbed the flagstones of the royal kitchen at Waikihome Palace, and I promise you, I remember that winter better than I remember yesterday. It was the winter they found the box. They'll tell you it never happened. The palace was very good at making things not have happened. But I was there. I was 17, and I was on my knees with a bucket of gray water, and I saw the whole thing with my own two eyes. So sit still, this is a true one. Waikihome was not a warm place, no matter what the paintings show you. People imagine a palace and they think of gold and candlelight and soft music drifting down long halls. And yes, there was some of that. But down where I worked, below the grand floors, it was stone and steam, and the smell of onions that never quite left your clothes. The kitchen I worked in wasn't the big one. The big kitchen fed the court, the guests, the endless streams of important men who came to bow at Queen Rowena and eat her food. That kitchen roared like a furnace all day. No, I worked in the small kitchen, the private one. It was tucked into the oldest part of the palace, near the queen's own apartments, and it existed for one reason only, to make the food the queen ate when no one was watching her eat it. Simple things: broth, bread, a boiled egg on the bad mornings. There's a strange thing about queens that nobody tells you. The higher up you go, the plainer the food gets. All those feasts are for other people. When Rowena was alone, she ate like a farmer's widow. The private kitchen had a floor of old gray flagstones, big square ones, each one the size of a dinner tray. They were uneven and cold and older than the palace itself, or so the head cook used to say. This floor, she'd tell me, was walked on before your grandmother's grandmother was a thought. I used to think she was just talking, cooks talk, but she was right as it turned out. That floor was old, and it was hiding something. That winter was a cruel one. The Ashmore winters always bit, but that year the cold came early and it came angry. The moat froze so hard the guards' children skated on it. Birds dropped out of the sky, stiff. And Queen Rowena, she was not a young woman anymore, and the cold got into her chest and would not leave. She was sick, is what I'm telling you. The whole palace felt it. When the queen is unwell, everything goes quiet in a way you can hear. The servants walk softer. The dogs don't bark. Even the great clock in the West Hall seemed to tick more gently, like it was trying not to disturb her. Now in a place like Waikihome there are always guards, but most of them you never really see. They're posts, not people. They stand at doors and gates like painted men, and you learn to walk past them the way you walk past a lamp. There was one, though, that everyone in the kitchens knew by name. Sergeant Edmund Croft. Croft was not young either. He'd served the crown longer than I'd been alive. He had a face like a cliff, hard, weathered, all straight lines and gray coming into his beard at the edges. He never smiled that I saw, not once. But there was something in the way he stood that made you feel, somehow, that the world was in order as long as he was on his post. He wasn't cruel, though. That's important. Some of the guards were, in that small way that men get when they've been given a little bit of power and nothing else. They'd bark at the kitchen boys, kick a stool aside, that sort of thing. Croft never did. He'd nod at you, just a small nod. And once, I've never forgotten it, I dropped a whole tray of copper pots on the stairs and they went off like thunder, and I stood there certain I was about to be shouted into the ground. And Croft, who was passing, just bent down without a word and helped me gather them up. Then he nodded and walked on. That was the man. I want you to understand him, because what he did later only makes sense if you know the kind of man he was. His post, that winter, was the corridor outside the Queen's private rooms, the most trusted post in the whole palace. You didn't get that post by luck. You got it by 30 years of being the sort of man a queen could sleep near. And the private kitchen, where I scrubbed those old flagstones, it opened right onto that same corridor. So Croft and I, though we were as far apart as two people could be in that place, we shared a little bit of the world. He stood in his corridor. I knelt in my kitchen. and through the open door I'd sometimes see his boots, planted like tree roots on the stone, hour after hour, never moving. I used to wonder what he thought about, standing there all that time. Later, I found out he'd been thinking about the floor. Here's how it started. It was the third week of the freeze. The Queen had been abed for days, and the doctors came and went with their long faces, and the whole palace was holding its breath. I was in the private kitchen at first light, before even the head cook came down, laying the fire so the room would be warm when the broth needed making. The private kitchen was empty and dark, just me and one candle, and I was on my knees near the great hearth, and I put my hand down on one of the flagstones to steady myself. And it moved. Just a little, just a soft rock the way a loose tooth rocks, but floors don't move. In 17 years I'd learned that much about the world. The ground stays where you put it. So I froze, and I pressed it again, and again it gave that small, wrong little tilt. I should have called someone. But I was 17, and I was curious, and it was cold and dark, and I was alone, and there is nothing on this earth more dangerous than a curious girl with a candle. I got my fingers into the seam at the edge of the stone. The old mortar there had gone soft and crumbly, like stale bread. And I worked at it and worked at it, and my heart was going like a rabbit's, and the stone lifted. Not far, an inch, but under it, I swear this to you, under it there was not more stone. There was a dark space, a hollow, and a smell came up out of it that I've never forgotten. Old cloth, old dust, and underneath that, very faint, something sweeter and sadder that I couldn't name. The smell of something that had been loved once and then shut away for a very long time. I got the stone up a little higher, and my candle tipped, and the light fell down into the hollow. And I saw the corner of a box. I don't know how long I knelt there. Time went strange. My hands had stopped shaking, which frightened me more than if they'd been shaking, because it meant some deep part of me had gone very still and very serious, the way you do when you know without knowing that your whole life is about to change. And then I heard the boots. Slow, heavy, coming down the corridor, and I knew that step. Everyone in that wing knew that step. Croft was walking his round. I dropped the flagstone. I dropped it too fast, and it landed with a crack that sounded in that silent room like a gunshot. I heard the boots stop. Then they came toward the kitchen door. Now understand, I was a scullery girl caught prying up the Queen's own floor. In those days, that was the kind of thing that got you thrown out into the snow with nothing, or worse. My mind was screaming at me to run, to lie, to throw my apron over the stone and pretend to be scrubbing. But I couldn't move. I just knelt there with my hand on the flagstone and my candle guttering, and Sergeant Edmund Croft filled the doorway. He looked at me, then he looked at the floor, at the loose stone under my hand and the thin black line of the hollow beneath it. I waited for the shout. It didn't come. Instead, something happened in his face that I had never seen there before. That hard cliff face of his, it changed. Just for a moment. And I understood with a jolt that went straight through me that Sergeant Croft was not surprised. He was not surprised at all. "You felt it move," he said. "It wasn't a question." I couldn't speak. I nodded. He came into the kitchen. He was a big man, and he had to duck a little under the old beam. He crossed to me and knelt down, his knees cracked like the stone had, and he put one huge hand flat on the floor beside the loose flag, very gently, the way you'd put your hand on the flank of a horse you didn't want to spook. 30 years, he said, so quiet I almost missed it. 30 years I've stood in that corridor, and every winter when the frost gets into the stones and lifts them, I've felt this one. Under my boot, I never let myself look. "Why?" I whispered. It was the only word I had. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said something I've turned over in my mind for 60 years. "Because some floors," he said, "you don't lift unless you're ready to carry what's underneath." He should have reported it. That was the rule, and Croft was a rule of a man. Anything unusual near the Queen's rooms, you reported it at once up the chain. A loose stone, a hollow under the floor, a box hidden in the dark. By every law of that palace, Sergeant Croft should have marched straight to the captain of the household and sounded the alarm. He didn't. And I've come to believe that was the first truly disobedient thing that good man had done in his whole long life of obedience. And I've come to believe he did it out of something bigger than the rules. He looked at that dark seam in the floor, and some instinct in him, some old soldier's instinct, told him, whatever this is, it is the Queen's, and it is private. And it has been kept secret for a reason, and that reason may be a wound, and you do not go tearing open another person's wound in front of the whole court just because the rules say you may. So he made a choice, and he made me part of it, though I was only a girl. Not a word, he said to me. Not to the cook, not to the other girls, not to your own pillow. Do you understand? I nodded so hard my neck hurt. We'll set it right, he said. We'll put the stone back, and it'll go on being hers. He started to lower the flag back into place. And then I'll never know what made me do it. I put my hand on his wrist. A scullery girl laying her hand on the sergeant of the Queen's Guard. I could have been whipped for it. But someone hid it, I said. Someone hid it and never came back for it. What if I didn't know how to say what I meant? What if it's waiting? What if it's supposed to be found? He stopped. The candle burned between us. Outside, the wind was tearing at the palace, and somewhere far above, the great clock ticked its careful, quiet tick. And Sergeant Croft looked at that loose stone for a very long time. Then he lifted it fully out and set it aside, and he reached down into the cold, dark hollow with both hands, and he brought up the box. It was iron, black iron, small enough to hold in two hands, with a lid gone orange with rust at the corners. There was a clasp but no lock, as if whoever hid it had wanted it kept but not kept out, as if they'd hoped, somewhere deep, that one day the right hands would open it. Croft set it on the flagstone between us. He didn't open it, he just looked at it, and I saw his throat move. There was a winter, he said slowly, long before you were born, girl, before the Queen was old. There was a winter this palace nearly fell. I'd heard whispers of it. Every old servant had a piece of the story. They called it the Cold Rising, a time when powerful men had turned against the crown, when soldiers who should have been loyal had marched on Waikihome itself, and for 3 days and 3 nights nobody knew whether Ashmore would have a queen at the end of it. I was young, Croft said, younger than you'd believe looking at me now. I stood on the walls those 3 nights. We didn't know if morning would come. He touched the rusted lid with one finger so gently. And the Queen, she was not much more than a girl herself then, newly crowned. Everyone said she'd break, a girl queen with traitors at her gate. She didn't break, I said. No, and here I promise you the hardest man in Ashmore smiled. Just barely, just at one corner. No, she did not. And do you know, in all the years since, I never once let myself wonder how a frightened girl of a queen found the iron to hold this crown through those 3 nights. He looked at the box. I think, he said, the answer's been under my boot the whole time. And he undid the clasp, and he lifted the lid. I leaned in with my candle, and what was inside that box was not gold. It was not jewels. It was not any of the things a girl imagines when she imagines a secret hidden under a queen's floor. It was cloth, a small bundle of pale cloth, yellowed with age, folded with a care that made my chest hurt to look at. And when Croft lifted it out so carefully, and the folds fell open across his big rough hands, it was a christening gown, a baby's gown, tiny, the kind a child wears exactly once, on the day it's given its name and its place in the world. And beneath where the gown had lain, there was a bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue, and a small thing that caught my candlelight and threw it back, a locket, silver, on a fine chain. Croft did not move for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I'd never heard from him. A queen, he said, does not hide a child's gown under a kitchen floor for no reason. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet, and I have never in my life been so frightened and so moved at the same time. "Whatever's in these letters," he said, "it is the reason she held the crown, and it may be the reason this palace has a queen at all." He wrapped the gown back around the letters gently, gently, like it was still warm, "and it is going to shake this monarchy to its foundations." Above us, faint through the stone, a bell began to ring. The queen's bell. She was awake, and she was calling for someone. The bell. I have to tell you what a bell like that does to a servant's body. You don't decide to move. Your body moves for you. 60 years later, if I close my eyes, I can still feel it, that jolt up the spine, that cold water down the back of the neck. The queen was awake, and the queen was ringing, and every rule I had ever been taught screamed at me to be on my feet and moving. But Croft's hand came down on my shoulder, just rested there. And he was so steady, that man, that his steadiness went into me through his hand like warmth through a wall. "Wait," he said. "But the bell. Someone will answer it. There are night women for that." His eyes stayed on the box. "Listen to me now, girl. What we have found, we cannot unfind it, but we can be careful. Do you understand? Careful." I nodded. I didn't understand at all, but I nodded. He set the iron box down on the flagstone with the gown folded back over the top, and he untied the ribbon on the letters. It had gone so brittle it snapped rather than came loose, and a little of it crumbled into blue dust on his palm. I remember thinking, someone tied that ribbon in a hurry once, with a beating heart, and it had sat in the dark keeping its knot for longer than I'd been alive. He unfolded the first letter. The paper was soft as cloth from age, and he held it toward my candle, and his lips moved as he read, and I watched a soldier's face do things I had never seen a soldier's face do. Now I could read. That was rare for a scullery girl, and I owe it to my mother, who'd been a parson's servant and taught me my letters before she died. So when Croft's hands began to tremble, actually tremble, that great slab of a man, I said, very quietly, "Let me. Your hands are cold." It was a kindness dressed up as a small lie. His hands weren't cold, but he let me take the letter, and I think, looking back, he was glad not to be the one holding it. I'm going to tell you what those letters said. Not word for word, I couldn't do that, and anyway some of it is not mine to give. But I'll tell you the shape of it, the way it came to us there on that cold floor, one page at a time, the candle burning down. The letters were written by a woman, and that woman was the queen, Rowena, but not the old Rowena upstairs with the frost in her chest. A young Rowena, a girl of 17 or 18, my own age, I remember realizing, and something in me went very still at that. She had written them during the cold rising. Those 3 days and 3 nights when the traitors were at the walls and no one knew if Ashmore would have a crown by morning. The young queen had sat somewhere in this palace, alone, and she had written letters. Not to generals, not to allies, not commands or pleas for rescue. She had written to a child. I want you to picture it, because it took me a long time to be able to. A girl, newly a queen, and only because everyone above her in the line was dead, surrounded by old men who bowed to her face and schemed behind her back. Soldiers outside her walls who wanted her gone, and she is not writing to save her throne. She is sitting by a candle in a palace that might fall, writing letters to a baby. Because, and this was the thing that came up out of those pages like cold water, because she'd had a child. Before the crown, before all of it, when she was barely more than a girl and still allowed to be an ordinary person, she had loved someone and she had borne a child, and it had been taken from her. Not died, taken. That was the part that stopped my heart. The letters were clear, though the young queen never said an ugly word about it. The men who managed the crown, the same old men who would later bow to her, they had decided a girl who might one day wear the crown could not have such a thing in her past. So they had taken the baby quietly away, given it to be raised by others, somewhere far, under some other name, in some ordinary life. And they had told the girl it was for the good of the kingdom, and they had told her to forget, and they had given her a throne to fill the hole where her child had been. And she had not forgotten. Of course she had not forgotten. No mother does. So on the worst nights of her life, the very nights the kingdom nearly fell, she had done the only thing she could. She had written to the child she was not allowed to keep, told it everything, told it who its mother truly was, told it she was sorry, told it that everything she was about to do, all the hardness she would have to grow, the crown she would have to become, she was doing it so that there would still be a kingdom for the child to be safe in, somewhere, even if she could never hold it again. I will be iron for you, one letter said, that line I do remember, word for word, because Croft read it aloud and then had to stop. I will be iron so that you may be soft. This is the only gift a mother in my chains can give. Croft put his hand over his mouth, a big rough soldier's hand, and I saw the water spill over and go down into his gray beard, and he made no sound at all, but his shoulders shook. 30 years, he said when he could speak. I stood on those walls those 3 nights. I watched the fires. I thought I knew what she was fighting for, the crown, the kingdom, her own life. He looked at the little christening gown, so small, folded on top of the iron box. I never once thought she was fighting for that. For a child none of us knew she had. She held the whole kingdom together, that frightened girl, so there'd be a safe country for a baby she'd never see again. He looked at me. That's not a queen holding a throne, he said. That's a mother holding a wall. And I have never, in all my long life, heard a thing said better than that. We didn't hear the second bell. I've thought about that so many times. If we hadn't been so lost in those letters, we'd have heard it and things might have gone differently. But we were somewhere else. We were on the walls in the cold, rising with a girl and her candle. And so we did not hear the second bell, nor the third, nor the sound of feet coming down the corridor. What we heard was a voice. "What," said the voice, "is that box doing out of the floor?" We both turned, and there in the kitchen doorway, in a nightgown and a heavy shawl, holding a lamp in a hand spotted with age and shaking with cold and something else, there stood Queen Rowena herself. I want to tell you I did the right thing. I want to tell you I curtsied, or fell to my knees, or fainted like a proper storybook girl. I did none of it. I just knelt there frozen with a dead woman's letters to a lost child in my 2 hands, and I looked up at the old, sick, terrifying Queen of Ashmore, and I could not move. Croft moved. He rose those cracking knees, and he stood between me and the Queen, not to threaten her, God no, to shield me, to put his own big body in the path of whatever was coming so that it would land on him first. That was Croft. 30 years of standing in front of the thing that might hurt the person behind him. It was so deep in him he didn't even think. "Majesty," he said, and then he said nothing else because there was nothing else a man could say. The Queen came into the kitchen. She was so thin. The illness had eaten her down to almost nothing, and the lamp shook in her hand, and I thought she should be in bed. She'll die of the cold down here. And she crossed those old flagstones she must have crossed 10,000 times that she had chosen. I understood now, on purpose to be near, and she stopped, and she looked down at the little gown folded on the iron box. And the terrible old Queen of Ashmore made a sound I will hear until I die. It wasn't a royal sound. It wasn't a queen's sound at all. It was the sound a person makes when a wound they've kept closed for 50 years is suddenly, gently touched. She sank down, right there on the cold floor in her nightgown, an old sick queen, down onto her knees on the stone beside the box. Croft moved to catch her, but she waved him off with one thin hand, not angry, just certain. And she reached out and she picked up that tiny christening gown, and she held it against her chest, and she bowed her head over it. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. What do you do? There is no rule for it. There is no training in the whole palace for the moment you watch a queen become, in front of you, only a mother. "I put it here myself," she said at last. Her voice was very small. "With my own hands, the winter of the Rising. I couldn't keep it in my rooms. They searched my rooms. They searched everything I owned, those men, to be sure I'd moved on." She said moved on the way you'd hold a dead rat by the tail. But no one searches a kitchen floor. No one thinks a queen would kneel on the ground and pry up a stone in the dark. So that's where I put my whole heart, under the place where the plainest food was made. Because I was the plainest thing in this palace, under all the gold. I was just her mother. She looked up, and she looked for the first time properly at me. "You're the one who felt it move," she said. I found my voice from somewhere. "Yes, Majesty, I'm sorry, I never meant to." "How old are you, child?" "17, Majesty." Something crossed her face. 17. The age she'd been. I saw her understand it the way I'd understood it, that strange bridge across all those years. 17, she repeated softly. "And you didn't run to tell the whole palace what you'd found. You could have. A story like this, a scullery girl could sell a story like this and never scrub a floor again." She looked at Croft. "And you, Edmund, 30 years I've watched you stand in that corridor. You felt this stone under your boot every winter, didn't you?" Croft's jaw worked. "Yes, Majesty." "And you never lifted it?" "No, Majesty." "Why?" And Croft said, quietly, the same thing he'd said to me at the very beginning, before either of us knew what was under the floor. "Because some things a person hides, they hide for a reason. And it's not a guard's place to tear open a wound just because he can reach it." The Queen looked at him for a long, long moment. "No," she said. "No, it isn't, but it was your place tonight to guard it, and you did." Her voice caught. "You've been guarding my heart under your boot for 30 years, Edmund Croft, and you never even knew. I'm going to stop here and tell you something, because I'm old and I've earned the right to say what I think. People imagine that the shocking thing, the thing that shakes a monarchy, is always something ugly, a murder, a theft, a betrayal buried under the floorboards. That's what the word hidden makes us think, isn't it? Hidden means shameful, hidden means guilty. But that's not always true. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a whole kingdom, the thing that could shake a throne to its foundations, is simply love that was not allowed. A mother's love, folded up small and buried in the dark, because the men who ran the world had decided it was a threat to the crown. And I've come to believe there's nothing more powerful than that. Not armies, not gold, nothing. Because sitting on that cold kitchen floor that night was proof of it. An old queen who had ruled Ashmore with a hand of iron for 50 years, feared, obeyed, unbending, the strongest monarch the kingdom had known. And the whole time, every day of it, the iron had only ever been a wall built around one soft and broken thing. "I will be iron so that you may be soft." She'd meant it, she'd lived it for 50 years. The Queen untied the letters, my letters, the ones still in my hand. I passed them to her and my fingers didn't want to let go. They'd become so much a part of me in that 1 hour, and she went through them one by one. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. She'd written them. She just touched each one, the way you touch the face of someone you love who's sleeping. And then she came to the locket. The silver one, on the fine chain that had caught my candlelight down in the hollow. She hadn't touched it yet. And when she picked it up, her hand shook worse than the illness alone could explain. "I never opened it," she whispered. "In 50 years. I put it in the box and I closed the lid and I never once let myself open it, because if I opened it, I'd never close it again. Do you understand? Some things you can only survive by not looking at them." She held it a moment longer, and then she looked at me, at the 17-year-old girl. The age she'd been, and she held it out. "You open it," she said. "You have young hands, and you were brave enough to lift the floor. Be brave enough for me now." I took the locket. It was warm from her hand. My thumbnail found the tiny seam and I pressed, and it opened with a small click that seemed, in that silent kitchen, as loud as the whole world cracking open. And inside the locket there were two things. On one side, a curl of hair. So fine, so pale, baby's hair, the kind that never grows on anyone again once they're past a certain age. 50 years old and it still had the softness of it, that impossible newness. I've held a lot of small, precious things in my long life. Nothing has ever felt as fragile in my hand as that little curl of a lost child's hair. And on the other side of the locket, a painting. Tiny, no bigger than my thumbnail, the kind a poor artist does quick and cheap. A baby's face. Round, half asleep, one little fist up against its cheek. And below the face, scratched into the silver itself with a pin or a needle, not by any craftsman but by a shaking hand in the dark, 3 letters. A name or the start of one. Tom. The Queen made that sound again, the wound sound. Thomas, she whispered. I named him Thomas. For 1 hour before they took him, he was Thomas. They gave him some other name after. I never learned it, they made sure of that, but for 1 hour in this world, my son was Thomas. She took the locket back from me so gently, and she held it against the tiny christening gown, and she rocked just slightly, the way every mother in the history of the world has rocked, and she was not a queen at all. She was the oldest, plainest grief you ever saw, wrapped in a shawl on a cold kitchen floor. Now, I told you at the start this was a true one, and I told you the palace was very good at making things not have happened. So you might be wondering if this shook the whole monarchy. Why haven't you heard of it? Why isn't it in the histories? I'll tell you, but you have to understand what happened next, because it's the heart of the whole thing. We stayed on that floor a long time, the 3 of us. The candle burned right down, and Croft lit another from the hearth without being asked. And slowly, as the worst of it passed through her, the Queen began to talk, not as a queen giving orders, as an old woman finally able to say a thing out loud after 50 years of swallowing it. She told us the rest. She had never stopped looking. That was the thing. All those years, all that iron, and quietly, secretly, in the only ways a watch queen could, she had never once stopped trying to find out where they'd sent her Thomas. And a few years back, an old man on his deathbed, one of the last of those who'd managed the crown in her girlhood, had unburdened his conscience before he went. He told her where the child had gone. A farming family. Good people, plain people in the far north of Ashmore near the border hills. They'd raised the boy as their own and never known whose he truly was. And the boy, the man now, for he was near 50 himself, had grown up and married and had children of his own, and he was a shepherd on the northern fells. And by every account she'd been able to gather in secret, he was happy. He was well. He was loved. He doesn't know, she said. He has never known. He thinks he's a shepherd's son. He thinks his mother was a farm woman who died when he was small. She looked at the tiny painted face in the locket. And do you know, I have decided that is the greatest thing I have ever done, greater than holding the throne through the rising, greater than 50 years of rule. The greatest thing I ever did for my son was to let him stay a shepherd. Croft frowned. Majesty, you could bring him home. Now, tonight, a word from you and what, she said, not sharp, gentle. Make him a prince at 50. Tear him out of his life, off his own hills, away from his own children, and set him down in this cold palace full of men who'd measure him for weaknesses and teach his grandchildren to bow. Put a crown near his head so that every schemer in Ashmore starts sharpening knives. She shook her head slowly. I spent my whole life being iron so that he could be soft. Am I to undo it all now at the end because I'm lonely and I'm dying and I want my boy? That's not love, Edmund. That's just wanting. Love is the other thing. Love is letting him keep his happy, ordinary life and never knowing the storm it cost to give it to him. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had dropped. The freeze was breaking, somewhere out there in the dark. You could feel it, that first give in a hard winter, the thaw that comes when the worst is finally over. Then why dig it up at all? I asked. I know I shouldn't have kept speaking a scullery girl, questioning the Queen, but it had stopped being about ranks down there on that floor in that hour. If it's all to stay hidden, Majesty, why did any of this need to happen? And she looked at me with those old, old eyes, and she gave me the answer I've carried for 60 years. Because a thing kept secret dies with the person who keeps it, she said. And I am dying, child, soon. And I could not bear that Thomas should live his whole life and never in any corner of the world have been known, loved out loud, named by a voice that wasn't only mine. She reached out and took my young hand in her thin cold one, and she took Croft's great rough one in the other. So now 3 people know. A brave girl who lifted the floor. A faithful man who guarded it 30 years without knowing what he guarded, and his mother. Her voice broke and mended and went on. That's enough. That's not a secret anymore, that's a keeping. You can't keep a thing all alone, but 3 of us can keep it, even after I'm gone. And that is why you have never heard of it. Not because it was covered up by frightened men. For once, it was the opposite. It was kept, chosen, protected, held safe by 3 people who understood that some love is too big and too fragile to survive being famous. The men 50 years before had hidden the child out of shame and calculation. We hid him now out of the purest thing there is. And the difference between those 2 hidings is the whole difference between cruelty and love, though they can look the same from far away. We put the box back. The Queen wanted it so. We laid the letters in, and the gown, and the locket last of all, though she kept the locket in her hand a moment longer and pressed it once to her lips before she set it down. And Croft lowered the flagstone back into its place, and he took a little fresh mortar the head cook kept for the ovens, and he sealed the edges himself, on his knees, this sergeant of the Queen's Guard, doing a mason's work in the dark so that no one would ever feel that stone move again. "It'll go on being yours, Majesty," he said, the same words he'd said to me at the very start, before we knew. "As long as I stand in that corridor, it'll go on being yours." And it did. The Queen died that spring. The thaw came and the birds came back, and she went with them, quietly in her sleep. And the histories will tell you she was a hard and iron queen who ruled Ashmore 50 years and held it through the cold rising, and never once showed a moment's weakness in all her reign. And that's true, every word of it is true. It's just not the whole of it. The whole of it was under a kitchen floor. I have a few more things to tell you, and then I'll let you go. Sergeant Edmund Croft stood his post another 2 years after the Queen died, and then his knees finally gave out, and they pensionied him to a little cottage on the palace grounds. I used to bring him bread. He never smiled more than that one corner of his mouth, not even at the end, but he'd nod at me, that small nod, the same one from the copper pots on the stairs, and I understood that between him and me there was a thing that didn't need smiling. We had knelt on a cold floor together and held a queen's heart in our hands and given it back to her. There aren't words for what that makes 2 people to each other. There's just the nod. He told me once near the end, sitting by his little fire, I stood outside a great many important doors in my life, girl, guarded a great many important things, treaties, jewels, the Queen's own body, and the most important thing I ever guarded I guarded for 30 years without knowing it was there, under my boot the whole time. He looked into the fire. Makes you wonder what else a man stands over all his life and never knows. He died the winter after, in the cottage by the fire. I like to think of him standing his post somewhere still. As for me, I did not sell the story. I could have. 100 times over the years, a scullery girl who knelt with the Iron Queen and learned her secret. There were men who'd have paid gold for it. There still are. But you can't keep a thing all alone, the Queen told me, and 3 of us can keep it even after I'm gone. And so I kept it. Through my whole long life I kept it, right alongside Croft, and after he was gone I kept it alone, which she'd said you can't do, but I found you can if you've had the practice of keeping it with others first. That's the trick of it. Nobody can start out keeping a thing alone, but you can finish alone if you began together. And I never went north. I want you to know that. I never once went looking for the shepherd on the fells. Some part of me ached too to see his face, to see if he had her eyes, to stand at his gate and just look at the happy, ordinary life she'd bled 50 years to buy him. But I understood, the way she'd made me understand on that floor, that love is the other thing. Love is not going. Love is letting the ending she chose stay the ending. He'll be long dead now himself, that shepherd. Thomas, for 1 hour of his life. His children will have children, and those children up there on the northern hills, tending their sheep, not one of them knowing that royal blood runs in them, that a queen once held a kingdom together with her bare hands so that they could grow up free and plain and unafraid. And that is exactly, precisely, to the last detail, what she wanted. She won. In the only battle that ever truly mattered to her, that frightened girl of a queen won completely, and the proof of her victory is that her own descendants will never know there was a war. I told you at the start I'm an old woman now and my hands shake when I pour the tea. They're shaking now, telling you this, but not the way they shook that night on the floor. That was fear. This is just years. I'm telling you now because I'm the last. Croft's gone. The Queen's gone. Thomas is gone and never knew. I'm the only one left in the whole turning world who knows that there is an iron box under a kitchen floor in Home Palace and what's folded inside it and what it cost and what it saved. And soon I'll be gone too. So now you know. That makes you a keeper. I've handed it to you the way she handed it to me, not to spread, not to sell, but to keep. To carry the knowing that once, in a cold country, a queen loved a child so much she chose to be a stranger to him forever, and buried her whole heart under the plainest floor in the palace, and became iron, so that somewhere far away a boy she'd never hold could grow up soft and safe and glad. They'll tell you it never happened. The palace was always very good at that. But you and I know better now. Some things stay hidden not because they're shameful, but because they're too precious to ever be shown. And the strongest thing I ever saw in my life wasn't a crown, or a wall, or a soldier's iron discipline. It was a mother, on a cold floor, choosing to stay forgotten so her child could stay free. That's the secret beneath the Queen's kitchen. Keep it well.